I'd like to now go into the second part of this series, and I've struggled with the title, and you can see the title that I've come up with now. And I'm trying to recast this book of Judges from a sort of, I would say, dark book that has got a lot of conflict in it, and there's a lot of fighting, and there's a lot of ups and downs in the stories that are contained inside of this book. But really, what this book is trying to do is to describe God bringing his people out of darkness and into his marvelous light. He's trying to lead them and guide them into a fullness of what it is to inhabit his promises. So a short way to say that is that he's leading them to become. And he's leading them directly, but also he's leading them through the various leaders that he brought up during this time. And so that's what we're talking about, and so that's how I've renamed this series, Led to Become. And the goal is that we also would be led and would be inspired by the contents of this book to become what God wants us to be, to learn from the mistakes that were made and learn from the great things that happened in this book of Judges and apply those things to our lives. So that, without further ado, that's really the main point, part of what we're going to be doing here. In part 2, we're going to start going through, and Mikhail, you can give me the next slide. We're going to start going through the introduction to this book, which is the entirety of chapter 1 of the book of Judges. The whole section, the whole first section that is the introduction, goes all the way to chapter 3, verse 6. But we're going to do chapter 1, which is the first part of the introduction. It gives us, if you go to the next slide, it's going to give us an example of the historical background of what's happening. And so it's going to give us the context, what's happening right now, and it's also going to help us understand why this book is written, why the next set of chapters from chapter 3 and onward exist. This whole introductory portion is set up to lead us to that and help us understand what we're about to read and help us comprehend it. And I've made a decision, all of the quotations from this series are all going to be taken out of the Christian Standard Bible, the CSB, which is a fairly modern translation. I believe it's factored and written to be understood at sort of a grade 5 level. And the point of this is I want to try and make sure that what I quote and what I do is fully comprehensible by our children, and they're able to read and understand what's going on. This is a great book also for children to read because there's a lot of stories in it. There's a lot going on. There's a lot of characters, and there's battles, and there's ups and downs, and there's cool storylines. So it is a fun book. I remember as a kid going into the Christian bookstore, and you'd get like the action comics, and when you went through the book of Judges, there was a lot of really good art and stories and cool stuff going on. So I quite enjoyed it. So we're going to be using the CSB, and I will be doing a lot of reading tonight. I'm going to read the most of chapter 1 of the book of Judges. So I'm going to do my best to read it well so that you can follow what's going on and then understand what's happening here, and Michaela will follow along on the overhead. I am now going to start out here in chapter 1. This gives us really a report from God's perspective of Israel's performance in what we're calling the Holy War, the time when they were to go in and conquer the land of Israel. You have a question? I know, it breaks them up quite a bit so that we have quite a few slides on the verses, so it's going to be tough. So Michaela, you'll just have to read along with me and follow along. And if there's a way we can do it better next time, we will. So let's start reading in Judges chapter 1. After the death of Joshua, the Israelites inquired of the Lord, "Who will be the first to fight for us against the Canaanites?" The Lord answered, "Judah is to go. I have handed the land over to him." Judah said to his brother Simeon, Come with me to my allotted territory, and let's fight against the Canaanites. I also will go up with you to your allotted territory. So Simeon went with him. When Judah attacked, the Lord handed the Canaanites and the Perizzites over to them, and they struck down 10,000 men in Bezek. And they found Adoni-Bezek in Bezek, fought against him, and struck down the Canaanites and the Perizzites. When Adoni-Bezek fled, they pursued him, caught him, and cut off his thumbs and big toes. Adoni-Bezek said, 70 kings with their thumbs and big toes cut off used to pick up scraps from under my table. God has repaid me for what I have done. They brought him to Jerusalem, and he died there. The men of Judah fought against Jerusalem and captured it and put it to the sword and set the city on fire. Afterward, the men of Judah marched down to fight against the Canaanites who were living in the hill country, the Negev, and the Judean foothills. Judah also marched against the Canaanites who were living in Hebron. Hebron was formerly named Kiriath Arba. They struck down Sheshai, Iman, and Talmai. From there, they marched against the residents of Debir. Debir was formerly called Kiriath Sefer. So this is a big chunk. What it's describing here really is the conquest of the whole area that a lot of future Israelite history will take part in. So we're around Jerusalem, we're around the Negev, the Judean foothills. These are places where Jesus would have walked and been around, about 1,000 years after this time. And so this area here is describing that whole thing. Judah was given, and the next slide, Judah was given the largest tract of land in Palestine, and Simeon was given the smallest. And this was basically because of their size. Judah was one of the largest tribes. Simeon was the smallest tribe. In fact, all of the men that they were able to put together to fight in battle was half that of the average of the rest of the tribes. It was quite small. And so Judah thought, I can get a little bit of extra help if I offer to help Simeon, because the area that he has to go fight against is quite small, and ours is quite big. So we'll join together and work together. And eventually, this actually almost foretells a little bit of what kind of does happen. The tribe of Simeon ultimately ceases to exist and gets sort of amalgamated into Judah. Over the next 100 years or so, we stop hearing anything about Simeon, and the people in that land have just sort of joined the larger tribe of Judah. Then we have this guy, Adoni-Bezek. So Adonai, does anyone know what Adonai means? It's just a title. It means Lord or King or High Ruler. So Adoni-Bezek means King of Bezek. This is a title and not a name. And it makes sense because he talks about the fact that he had kings underneath of his table. And really, instead of total destruction of Bezek, we have Adoni-Bezek kept alive and then humiliated. If you guys can think about it for a second, kids, do this for a second. Take your hands and then put your fingers like this. Get your thumb like that. Okay, now try and pick up your pencil and write. It's pretty hard, right? You can get those ones in there, but without that thumb, it just becomes more difficult. And to hold a hammer or to hold any tools becomes very hard. It's, of course, the opposable thumb that makes human beings somewhat unique in that we can grip things like this quite nicely and easily. Excellent, good job. Well, hopefully you don't have to get your thumb cut off. Without your big toe, you also can't balance quite well. It's very hard to run without your big toe or to keep balance. And so this was done as a humiliation, but also to keep kings from attacking you again or attacking you again with their mighty men because they couldn't hold swords. This was a common Canaanite practice, not an Israelite practice. We don't see the Israelites doing this at all, but this was a common Canaanite. Why do we know it was common Canaanite practice? Because Adoni-Bezek said, I had 70 kings underneath of my table picking up scraps with no thumbs and no big toes. It wasn't actually 70 kings. The term 70 is used here to indicate a lot. He's bragging on himself of how powerful he is and how many people he had humiliated. And he then, of course, ascribes to God the fact that this humiliation is brought to him because of what he had done to these other Canaanite kings. Interesting, though, if he is saying this is God paying me back for what I've done, it's rather interesting that it's the Israelites who are carrying out that same humiliation upon him. So actually, this story describes a failure on the part of the Israelites to do what they were supposed to do. They were supposed to go there, destroy the town. That was God's judgment, and then they would move on. But instead, they found the king, and they went out of their way to humiliate him and drag him from Bezek to Jerusalem, where he finally died. This was not God's will. And so, we can go to the next slide, Mikhailo. This humiliation of Adonai-Bezek was a failure on the part of the Israelites. This was an ethical and moral failure on a part of the Israelites that's being described here. Even though it absolutely was some punishment from God against Adonai-Bezek for what he had done, and it's great that he actually recognizes where it's coming from, at the same standpoint, it's not the way that God had intended for this to happen. It's not the way he had told the Israelites to do this. And they went outside of the will of God and did something separate. And it's very possible that because of what they did there, what's then later described in the following verses, after verse 8, when they go down to Jerusalem, capture it, and put it to the sword, ultimately, that doesn't stick. And we find out shortly afterwards that Jerusalem has to be conquered again. So it's possible that there is a bit of judgment going on there for the way that they had dealt with Adonai-Bezek. However, the text doesn't strictly tell us this. But we can see already that the ethics of the Israelites are being twisted away from what God had taught them. Yes, brother?
When you keep bringing up brought to the sword, I keep asking myself, does that mean a type of law that they had at that time?
That's a good question. So the question is putting to the sword reference to a type of law that they had at the time. It's not. In this case here, it's just a phrase to indicate that they destroyed the city through military means. They conquered it militarily, not by any other way. However, that's a good question because there are some phrases, there is a phrase that we're going to talk about in here that does kind of point back to a law that they don't follow. So that's kind of like some foreshadowing there. And so we're actually going to get into that right now. So well done. That transitions us nicely. If we go to the next slide, it should say a bit further back. So I'm going to back up just a little bit here to talk about this destruction of the city and why Adonai-Bezek was a failure. It helps put it into context. So we need to look at what they were supposed to do in the promised land. Let's go to the next slide, which should be Deuteronomy 7, 1-2. And I'm going to read that here for you. When the Lord your God brings you into the land you are entering to possess, and he drives out many nations before you, the Hittites, the so on and so forth, 7 nations more numerous and powerful than you, and when the Lord your God delivers them over to you, and you defeat them, you must completely destroy them. Make no treaty with them, and show no mercy. So God's judgment has been placed on these cities, and God is not leaving it to the discretion of the Israelites on how they're supposed to do this. Should they negotiate? Should they keep people alive? Should they keep cities intact? Should they keep so on and so forth? He's saying you must completely destroy them. You might remember, cast your mind back to the Amalekites, or I guess in this case here it would be forward to the Amalekites and Saul's treatment of them. You can look back to, in this case here, back to when Joshua dealt with Jericho and how Jericho was supposed to be dealt with. Destroyed, don't touch anything. So that's Deuteronomy 7 and 1. Deuteronomy 20, 16 and 17 says, however, you must not let any living thing survive among the cities of these people the Lord is giving to you as an inheritance. You must completely destroy them, as the Lord your God has commanded you. So God, again, is reiterating, this is my judgment. You do not get to interpret this. You don't get to change this and do anything else with this. You don't get to make slaves out of the people. You don't get to keep their flocks or their stuff. You don't get to keep their city. It's my judgment, not yours. You destroy it. And so all the Israelites were supposed to do is go in, do what God had said they were supposed to do. God was going to give them the victory. They were to destroy it and move on. That is what we get described in Judges 1 and I think it's 10, when Judah went in and captured Jerusalem. We see that they put the town to fire, but it didn't stick. And we'll come back to that in a moment. And so, next slide, this is the fill in the blank. When they were not to act on their own volition, they were to carry out the prescribed judgment of God. No interpretation, no volition, no trying to make themselves more wealthy off of the produce or off of the livestock or off of the slaves or off of the city. They were to destroy it and move on. It was not theirs. It was not theirs to keep. It was to be rendered back unto God, basically as a type of sacrifice. Now, we do have record of the Israelites agreeing to this. If we go to the next slide, we have Numbers 21, 2 and 3, and it says, "Then Israel made a vow unto the Lord. If you will hand this people over to us, we will completely destroy their cities. The Lord listened to Israel's request and handed the Canaanites over to them. And Israel completely destroyed them and their cities. So they named the place Hormah." Now, go to the next slide, Mikhailo. This gives us this thing that we call the Law of Harem. Harem is the root word of the city name of Hormah, the town that was then destroyed by the Israelites. The word destroy in verse 2 of Numbers 21 is the word harem. The word harem is interesting. It means a ban. It is a ban. So go to the next one, Mikhail, is a fill in the blank here. Harem is a ban. It is the dedicating of something secular, so something worldly, fleshly, non-holy. It's the dedicating of something secular to God. It means to ban that thing or to devote it to God and to exterminate it. So it's like a sacrifice. It is, if you think about it for a second, if you were to roll into the city and God said, okay, now you have to destroy it and you're going to conquer it, it's going to be easy to say, well, can we conquer everything except for like the king's palace? And can I just live there? And can I just maybe keep all these cows? Because they're kind of nice and they've been here for a while. And can I just maybe keep all this gold? Right? That was tried in Jericho, and it hurt the Israelites badly when certain things were kept from Jericho, certain parts of the sacrifice. If you put your mind towards Samuel's sons or Eli's sons and the description of them taking parts of the sacrifice for themselves without letting them be burnt, they're not harem. They're not giving that to God. It's not devoted to him, but instead they're taking of it. And so we get this idea of this law, to go kind of to your point, Brother Eli, the law of harem. That is what it's called. And it's difficult to see this in English, but when you go through and read this in Hebrew, when it comes to destroying cities, you'll see the word harem used when they've destroyed it, when they're giving it over to God, when they're doing that. And so that's why they call it the law of harem. So in this verse, in verse 2, Israel vows to harem the city. Mikhailo, could you go back to Numbers 21 and 2? Great. So right here, when they say we will destroy, they're saying we will harem the city. And we will basically offer this as a sacrifice to you, God. And we won't redeem any of it. It will be for you. And of course, they then got victory. So this law of harem, if Mikhailo, you can go to that slide now, this law is important for us to understand the rest of this introduction in history, because we're going to see the times when Israel violates this law, and they do so many ways. And what, of course, are they violating? They vowed to God. We made a vow with God. We will harem the city if you will give it to us. Basically, we will devote it to you, God, if you will give it to us. Remove this obstacle from our way, and we will devote it to you and not be made better about it. So keep that tucked away in your mind as we go through the rest of the introduction as well as the rest of this book. Now we're going to go to the next piece here. There's a bit of an aside that happens here regarding this woman, Achsa. So this is Judges 1, 12 to 15. Mikhailo, the next slide. Right here. It's an aside about Achsa. So if you're in your Bible, go to Judges 1, 12 to 15. And it reads, Caleb said, "Whoever attacks and captures Kiriath Sefer, I will give my daughter Achsa to him as a wife." So Othniel, son of Kenaz, Caleb's youngest brother, captured it. And Caleb gave his daughter Achsa to him as his wife. Later, she arrived and persuaded Othniel, her new husband, to ask her father for a field. She arrived, and as she arrived, she got off of her donkey, and Caleb asked, "What do you want?" So obviously, she came to him in a demeanor that showed, "I'm going to ask you something." And she answered and said to him, "Give me a blessing." In the Hebrew, this sounds a lot more like an entreating. So the language that's used here is used of a younger person entreating someone who they respect and asking them for a favor and for a blessing. It doesn't read that well, that same way in English, so I just wanted to kind of point that out for you. "Since you have given me land in the Negev, give me springs also." The Negev is a desert place. So Caleb gave her both the upper and lower springs. So we must not misread this scripture here through Western eyes. Obviously, what we see here is a bit vulgar to our sensibilities, in that there is a woman who is given as a wife to somebody else because of a military victory, because someone went and destroyed something. And obviously, this is not something we would do today. However, this was very much so a cultural norm at the time. And in fact, and without being too bold or forward, it's very possible that Achsa was delighted with this match because she was going to marry a mighty man, someone who was victorious, but also someone who was quite obviously full of faith. Because this person went and did what Caleb asked and went and did what God had asked, which of course was to go and to destroy this city. And he did. He did, not a tribe. Not Judah asking Simeon, "Hey, can you come with me?" This one guy, Othniel, went and did it, obviously with his entourage, but he would not have had the resources of an entire tribe. He was like a chieftain, and he went and he sacked a city, and he took a city. And then he left it. And so Caleb said, "You get this field in the Negev." Well, actually, he didn't get it. Achsa had to say to her new husband, "Hey, you've done this, you've won me, but could you also get a field for us? Like, can we have some land to live on? It'd be kind of nice. And, now you may as well strike when the iron's hot, right? Caleb's in a good mood because you just went and did this mighty act." And so he did. And he asked him for a field, and he got the Negev. And Achsa's like, it's good that you got some land, but it would be great if we had some water to put on the land to grow some crops. And so she's like, never let a man go do a woman's work. She goes to her father and says, "Can we have some springs, please?" And he says yes. Okay, this is an interesting story, but I want to point something out here. Achsa, Caleb, and Othniel are all Kenizzites. Kenaz was an Edomite chieftain from the line of Esau. They are not Israelites. I know. The great Hebrew warrior, Caleb, was not Hebrew. He was a proselyte. What does that mean? He was a convert. He joined God's people and committed himself to God's people and became a Jew via being a proselyte. Isn't that amazing? And so we have these people who are so invested in the things of God, who are converts from outside of the bloodline into the family and are so bought into God and what he is doing that they go and they do it with all faith. It's Joshua and Caleb, Joshua and Caleb, Joshua and Caleb. And then when Joshua's gone, Caleb doesn't hold up. He keeps going. Even though there's no appointed leader, he's the leader of his house. And he almost listens to the words of his great friend Joshua, as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. And so he chose. And so they all and I love this here because even Othniel goes and he follows the direction of Caleb and he follows the direction of God. He has faith, he does the work, and this whole thing is an aside showing basically, hey Israel, there's a lot of failures in this chapter that we're going to talk about, but I want to point out these people who weren't even Israelites, and they're listening to me. And they're doing a great job. I just love it. It's a really neat spot. So I think there's a fill in the blank. Next slide, please, Mikhailo. Caleb, Achsah, and Othniel had faith in God. And they paired faith with action. They paired action with their faith. Remember Othniel and Achsah, this is not the end of the story for them. We will return. Okay, Judges 1, 16 to 20. So that previous fill in the blank was just the word faith twice, in case you missed it. Okay, Judges 1 and 16. The descendants of the Canaanite, Moses' father-in-law, had gone up with the men of Judah from the city of the palms to the wilderness of Judah, which was in the Negev of Arad. They went to live among the people. Judah went with his brother Simeon, struck the Canaanites who were living in Zephath, and completely destroyed the town. And so they named the town Hormah. Judah captured Gaza and its territory, Ashkelon and its territory, and Ekron and its territory. The Lord was with Judah and enabled him to take possession of the hill country. But they could not drive out the people who were living in the plain because those people had iron chariots. They had high tech. Judah gave Hebron to Caleb, just as Moses had promised. Then Caleb drove out the 3 sons of Anak who lived there. And it was in that land there, of course, part of that land that Caleb gave to Othniel. So verse 17 retells the story of Hormah. It retells the story that we've already read in Numbers 21, 2-3. So it's reiterating here this law of Harem that was to guide the Israelites. So this here, verse 17 of Judges, is a retelling of Numbers 21, 2-3. And in fact, this entire chapter is very much so a review and shortened history of the things that we have mostly read in Joshua and in Numbers. The beginning of the book says, at the end of when Joshua died, and it says the history that we're going to tell you in this book starts then. But it then goes and gives us some back history. And it gives us some forward history. And in fact, the difference between the history that we read in Numbers and Joshua and the shortened version of this history here in Judges is, Mikhailo, if you can go to the next slide, the difference between the two is that of chronology and geography. So in Numbers and in Joshua, it's written in a sort of chronological form to help us kind of see this happened, and then this happened, and then this happened, and then this happened. Whereas this telling is actually done from a geographical perspective and with dealing with the individual tribes. We started with Judah, and we're going to move on through the rest of the tribes with an exclusion of only a few. And those tribes, of course, were each given a geographical region of Palestine to conquer. And so this history is a shortened geographical one. So when we read this one, don't read it like it's a chronology and like that what we're reading here happened after Joshua. Some of what we read here happened during Joshua's time. Some of it happened in the book of Numbers. And there's a lot of retelling of what's happening. But it's helping us to get to the place where we're at. The idea is you can pick up this book and read it, and it gives you enough back history to understand the period of the rulers that it's going to be talking about starting in chapter 3. Does that make sense? So it works kind of together as a single group. And now we're going to wrap up tonight just by giving us the rest of the summarized history that we get in the rest of this book. So jumping to Judges 1 and 21. This is going to describe the failure of Benjamin. At the same time, the Benjamites did not drive out the Jebusites who were living in Jerusalem. The Jebusites had lived among the Benjamites in Jerusalem to this day. So this is a reference, again, back to what happened in verse 8 when Jerusalem was taken by Judah. It was kind of, they moved in there, they put it to the sword, they lit it on fire, and they moved on. Obviously, the Jebusites left the city and then took it back again. And they came back to it. And if we could dig down far enough underneath Jerusalem, one day, we would see, of course, multiple layers going back even many more years. Jerusalem is a very old city and has been, inhabited for a long time. You might remember, of course, Melchizedek, the king of Salem. Salem is Jerusalem. Jebus is Jerusalem, and it had other names as well. And so at one time this was taken, and then, of course, we know all the way up to the time of David, the Jebusites lived there. It was basically a Jebusite city by the time David comes on the scene. This is all predating David by several hundred years. So the Benjamites, they failed. They basically, Jerusalem had been conquered, but they were not able to drive out the Jebusites, and they did not deal with the Jebusites as they were supposed to. Next, we're going to go to the next verse, Judges 1 and 22. The house of Joseph also attacked Bethel, and the Lord was with them. They sent spies to Bethel, the town formerly known as Luz. The spies saw a man coming out of the town and said to him, "Please show us how to get into your town, and we will show you kindness." And he showed them the way into the town. And they put the town to the sword, but released the man and his entire family. Then the man went into the land of the Hittites and built a town and named it Luz. And that is its name still today. So the approach taken here by the house of Joseph, a.k.a. the tribe of Ephraim, is similar to that taken by Joshua against Jericho. Spies were sent in. The difference is these spies didn't go into the town and reconnoiter the town and look around and try and find its weak spots. They seen someone coming out and started flexing and saying, basically, nice town you got there. Be a shame if anything happened to your family. Why don't you just show us how to get in there and we'll let you guys go. And their reputation had preceded them. And so this man said, fair play. This is how you get in. Secret knock, secret handshake, so on and so forth. And here's my family, let us go free. And so they let him go free. So it's a success, but it's also a failure, because that's not what God told them to do. He said, go and completely destroy the town. You don't get to show mercy. You don't get to decide how this is going to happen. And so all they ended up doing basically is moving Luz from one place to another. Because Luz moved from there, but it just became a town a little bit down the road. The problem wasn't dealt with. It was just moved over a little bit. This is part of our learning in the book of Judges, is we learn that there are things in life, especially after conversion, that we have to give over to God. We can't play with. We can't show mercy on. We can't decide we think we know how to control it. We have to give it to God. And if we don't, as we will see throughout this book of Judges, it only comes back to bite us later and cause us more grief in our walk with God. And so that's part of the story behind this book of Judges. So they succeeded, but instead of treating this man the same way they did with Rahab, which was basically, you will live with us and you will become one of us and you will come into our nation or what have you, they didn't do that. They let this guy go and do his own thing. But also they didn't carry out the judgment of God as they were supposed to have done. And so they let him go, and it just moved the problem further down. And then now, let's wrap up by reading Judges 27 to 36. There's a decent amount to go through and read here, and I'll stop from time to time. At that time, Manasseh failed to take possession of Beth-shan and Tanakh and their surrounding villages, or the residents of Dor, or Iblam, or Megiddo, and their surrounding villages. The Canaanites were determined to stay in this land. Obviously, they wanted to stay. When Israel became stronger, they made the Canaanites serve as forced labor, but never drove them out completely. At that time, Ephraim failed to drive out the Canaanites who were living in Gezer, so the Canaanites have lived among them in Gezer. Zebulun failed to drive out the residents of Kitron, or the residents of Naholo. So the Canaanites lived among them and served as forced labor. Asher failed to drive out the residents of Akko, or of Sidon, or Alhab, or. The Asherites lived amongst the Canaanites who were living in the land because they failed to drive them out. You hear that one? The Asherites lived among the Canaanites, not the Canaanites living among the Asherites, as we have read. So this one was so bad that they weren't really even the predominant peoples in the area, but it was the people who they were supposed to drive out who were still predominant. The Amorites faced the Danites in the... I missed Naphtali. Naphtali did not drive out the residents of Beth-Shemesh or the residents of Beth-Anan. They lived among the Canaanites who were living in the land, but the residents of Beth-Shemesh and Beth-Anan served as their forced labor. The Amorites forced the Danites into the hill country and did not allow them to go down into the valley. The Amorites were determined to stay in Har Herez, Al-Halon, and Shalbim. When the house of Joseph got the upper hand, the Amorites were made to serve as forced labor. The territory of the Amorites extended from the Scorpion's ascent, that is, from Sela upward. So what we read here is Manasseh is failing to take any possession. Ephraim, Zebulun, Asher, Naphtali, Dan, they all failed to drive out the Canaanites, or really, as they were supposed to have done, destroyed the towns and destroyed the people and destroyed everything. It was you guys remember Etch-a-Sketch? It was an Etch-a-Sketch time. God said, pick it up, shake it, put it back down again, net new. You don't get to keep any of their stuff. Right. Everything that you're going to get in here is going to be a blessing from me, not a blessing from other people, not a blessing from other things. And in fact, in some cases, they put the people to forced labor. Again, outside of the ethics that God had given to the people, outside of the morals he had given to the people. You weren't to go there and enslave these people for generations. And in fact, in some cases, the Israelites themselves were then enslaved again and put to forced labor to the benefit of the Canaanites who they were supposed to drive out. So we have like this dizzying array of things that were done well and things that weren't done well. It's like as they were going through and being successful, slowly it went to their heads, and they felt we can do this on our own. And in fact, watch this, we don't even have to work hard to destroy Luz. We're just going to show up, flex our muscles, find someone who's going to get us in, and then we'll just take the city. And God was excluded from the situation. So, final slide here, Mikhailo. In this first chapter of Judges, we see courage, faith, and commitment, but also unfulfilled commitments, compromise, and disobedience. We have kind of an incomplete possession of the land that occurs. That's what's being described here. This first chapter helps us to see the successes and failures of God's people after the death, of course, of their second leader, Joshua. The Israelites ultimately did not do as God had commanded, nor did they do as they had vowed to do. They did not follow on their commitment to the law of Harem. And this sets us up to see the struggle that they're going to encounter throughout the rest of their time in Judges. So we're going to learn a lot from the character studies and from the various people as we go through this book of Judges, but we can also learn from stuff like this. This is a great example of something that can happen in the conversion experience, where you repent, you're baptized, you're filled with the Holy Ghost, you start on this new life. But as God is giving you the dominion over things in your life that he wants to have removed, we sort of decide, not yet. I'm going to hold on to that piece, and I'm going to hold on to that piece. And God doesn't immediately come down and say, that's it, you didn't listen, done, and squish all these people out. He said, you guys have messed up. You have not done as you were supposed to. And that's what we're going to get to in next week's lesson. This week's gives us all of the background, all of the understanding of the historical aspect and of the failure to launch of these people. God was leading them into a place, and instead they decided to do their own thing in some areas. And it ultimately is going to turn out to